The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, why the time has come for sectoral bargaining, Bill Press on how Democrats can win back working-class voters, and a conversation with Tom LoBianco on his new biography of Vice President Mike Pence. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. One of the most pivotal issues for Democrats heading into 2020 is how to win back working-class voters. For Bill Press, there's a clear path that begins with economic justice and refuses to accept making a choice between race and class. And we say hello to Bill Press, host of the twice-weekly The Bill Press Pod, the author of numerous books, including Toxic Talk, From the Left, and most recently, Trump Must Go. As listeners to this program, you, of course, are very familiar with the voice of Bill Press. We carry segments from the Bill Press Pod each week in this podcast. Bill Press, from one podcast to another, welcome.
Jim, it's so good to join you. Podcast brothers here, right?
Indeed, yeah. Nice to talk with you as well.
Thanks.
So let's jump right into it. You recently spoke at a Netroots Nation conference on a panel titled How to Win Back Blue-Collar Workers in 2020. Let's start by talking about why such a conversation is even necessary. How did Democrats lose so many blue-collar voters to Donald Trump in 2016?
Well, as I said at that time, by the way, it was so exciting to be at that Netroots conference to see all these activists, progressives from all over the country, and their energy and enthusiasm was really contagious. But as I remarked there, I think I was a little surprised that this was the only panel at the entire Netroots conference that addressed this issue, which I think is the central issue of the 2020 campaign. It's the right conversation to be having, because I think in 2016 what happened is, and look at the result, Democrats kind of lost their way. Those forgotten Americans were forgotten by the Democratic Party. They were certainly forgotten by Hillary Clinton, who didn't speak to them, who didn't go to their states, certainly in the case of Wisconsin, who didn't talk about their issues. They felt, these are the Americans who felt left behind. They saw the profits in this economic recovery going exclusively to the top 1% or to the big corporations. They're experiencing these stagnant wages and have for a long time. They see their jobs disappearing. Their take-home pay is less than it was for middle-class workers like 30 years ago. They've increased housing costs and food costs and college tuition costs. And they needed somebody who was speaking to them, and Hillary didn't, and we got to get them back. And by the way, it wasn't that many, like something like 77,000 votes combined in like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan would have resulted in would have ended in a different result in 2016. So these are the people I think the Democrats have to be focused on, and they're the people that really need help and attention, and I think they're getting it too, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you argue that a populist economic message is key to winning back these voters. So what are some of the key policy elements of a populist economic platform?
I think we hear them talked about today, and I think, and I'm encouraged by that. I would start with a living wage, certainly minimum $15 living wage. Healthcare is the number one issue, I believe. It certainly was number one in 2018 with Democrats winning back the House, and the various aspects, just basic quality, affordable healthcare. add prescription drugs, and doing something about the cost of prescription drugs to that. Add dental care, and I think vision care. These are all things that are key. Affordable housing. You know, I interviewed Joaquin Castro not so long ago, the one that's running for president. I always get them mixed up. The presidential candidate, but I think it's Julian, right? That if there's a healthcare crisis in this country, there's a housing crisis in this country too, that most people are not aware of. The stock of affordable housing is really diminishing, and the price of existing housing is soaring. College tuition, a big middle class issue, and then the overall question of jobs, good quality jobs. So, I mean, those are the issues I believe that that's the core Democratic message. It always has been. This is the core Democratic base. And these are the issues I think we have to be talking about again to that base.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, you know, there was what I found interesting, something else that you said at Netroots Nation conference, that Democrats need to speak the language of workers. What does that sound like?
Sounds like Bernie Sanders. By the way, I don't mean that I've endorsed Bernie Sanders. I did in 2016 in the primary. But he certainly speaks that language. So does Elizabeth Warren, I would add quickly.
Sure.
And I think so does Joe Biden, with his Scranton roots. And he's always been somebody out there fighting for working class Americans. So I think across the board, I don't mean to exclude anybody, we are hearing this from the Democratic candidates for president in 2020. They're going to the middle class communities, and they're addressing middle-class voters and talking about middle-class issues. That's what the Democratic Party has to sound like.
Bill,
let me just add, Jim, if I can. I mean, it's like this sort of ties back to your first question, right? I mean, so we got the blue wall on the West Coast, right? California, where I come from. We got the blue wall in the Northeast, too, right? And let's just sort of hope we'll make some inroads in the South, too. So they're not going to go, those voters are not going to go away, right? Got to focus on that heartland, whatever you call it, the industrial belt, the Rust Belt, the heartland, where we lost the last time and where we can get them back if we talk about the issues that care to them, the issues that they talk about around the dining room table at night.
Well, how can Democrats overcome what sometimes, I guess, gets portrayed as competing agendas in a progressive platform? For example, a commitment to fighting climate change can be portrayed as ignoring the potential loss to blue-collar jobs in traditional industries or traditional energy industries.
Well, I would say to the extent we let that happen, we have walked into one of the oldest traps of all. But let me go back to one of my first jobs was I was a lobbyist in the California legislature for the Planning and Conservation League, which is an environmental lobby. So I was the environmental lobbyist along with the Sierra Club in the California legislature. And what we always heard from people is you got to choose between the economy or the environment, right? You can't have both. And that is total BS, which we said and proved at the time. I mean, the key to a healthy economy is a healthy environment. And I'd say vice versa. So now today, we can't let ourselves get into this. You got to choose between either or. That's a false choice. That's a false contradiction. Look at the Green New Deal. The essence of the Green New Deal was creating millions of new jobs by going to a fossil fuel-free or a renewable energy economy. That's where the new jobs are, and that's where the good-paying jobs are. Look, coal jobs are dying. Fossil fuel jobs are dying. A lot of manufacturing jobs are dying. So I think we have to let people know that, the key to new jobs, to better wages, better living conditions across the board is you got to tie them together. It's not either or anymore. It's all one, looking at the future and a Green New Deal future.
You know, you mentioned the coal jobs. I have a neighbor from West Virginia. Family worked for years and years in the mines. And we were having a discussion one day, and he talked about back when Bill Clinton started the whole retraining program. Let's get people to learn new technologies. We'll send them back to school and that kind of thing. And he told the story of a kind of a distant cousin who went back to school, and he got a degree in mine management. Well, that just doesn't make any sense.
No, I was going to say, what mine is it going to manage, right?
Right.
What mine?
Yeah. And so I think messaging is a huge part of this too, and we've got to, because that was such a great program, it was such a fantastic idea. Let's get some new fresh blood into new technologies and move on. And he chooses to stay in the cave. Another tension that comes up in the discussion of working class voters is the portrayal of these voters as predominantly white and likely to be resistant to a racial justice agenda. And that suggests that politicians must choose between racial justice issues and economic issues. What's wrong with that equation?
Again, I would say another false choice, a total false choice. First of all, it is important to understand that when you talk about helping people who are below the poverty level or at the poverty level or struggling today, we're not just talking about people of color. We're not just talking about Latinos, African Americans. There are a lot of Caucasian white American voters who are suffering as well. So I think it's across the board. But this idea that there's this conflict, I hear it too, Jim, and I always kind of beat it down, between racial justice and economic justice is just phony. It's baloney. I mean, look, the people I think who are impacted the most by low wages, by housing, cost of housing, cost of college tuition, by dirty air and dirty water are, for the most part, for a large part, people of color impacted the most. Remember, Martin Luther King, when he went to Memphis, he was a civil rights leader. He went to Memphis to lead a strike, participate in a strike on behalf of sanitation workers for a decent living wage. So they are together, and by stressing economic justice, we are stressing and focusing on racial justice at the same time. Economic justice, racial justice, social justice, they are all one and the same goal, serving all Americans in need.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking, of course, with Bill Press, host of the twice-weekly The Bill Press Pod. Of course, you hear Bill Press within our podcast each week. Also, the author of his most recent book, Trump Must Go, and I do enjoy that title. And speaking of Donald Trump, he is, of course, very fond of portraying himself as a champion of the working class, yet his policies have done little, if anything, to actually improve their lives. Are Democrats doing enough to get that message out?
No, not yet, I would say. And, that can't, I think we all would agree, that can't be the only message, right? It can't be, in 2020, it can't be just anti-Trump, Trump's bad, Trump's wrong, Trump's a liar, go down the list, right? But that does have to be part of it. And I think one way to show, and this really ties into what we've been talking about, one way to tie together is to show that the biggest lie of all that Donald Trump has uttered is the lie in 2016 that he would be the champion of working class Americans. He has done absolutely nothing for them, not fulfilled one of his promises. I mean, there are no new trade deals. He's talked about them, but none of them have gotten out of Congress. None of them have taken place. There are no new coal jobs, no new coal mines that have opened up, as we just talked about. There's no increase in the federal minimum wage. He has bankrupted the farmers with his tariffs. These are the people that he promised to help. Those tariffs, which are also going to result in higher prices, already are, for higher prices for all Americans shopping at either grocery stores or Walmart or Target or kind of wherever. I almost laughed out loud the other day when Donald Trump was doing this little rant about Fox News. The new Fox News, he said, isn't Trumpy enough, they have an occasional Democrat on. And the phrase he used was about Fox News. He said, they've forgotten the people who brought them there, right? Who got them where they are. Well, if anybody's done that, it's Donald Trump.
Right.
He has walked away from and forgotten the very people that he promised. So I think this is a key message for any Democratic candidate to the people we're talking about now, middle class, working class Americans. Yes, you might have been fooled in 2016. You were turned up by the politics of both parties, and you had this clown who came along, this Pied Piper who came along and said, I'm with you. I'm going to fight for you. He hasn't fought for you. What's the one accomplishment of the Trump administration? A tax cut for the wealthiest of Americans and permanent tax relief for the big corporations. That's Donald Trump. Nothing for the working class. Nothing for the working class.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of working class, union support has always been important to Democrats. But as Stephen Greenhouse has been pointing out, union membership has been falling across the country, and that could impact the ability of unions to wield political power. Bill, how important a role do you see unions playing in 2020?
I think as important, as big a role as ever before. It's very interesting, Jim, what's going on here. First of all, let's talk about the unions that are, doing the unions before they're union members today through their unions are really as organized as I've ever seen them. They're out there in the primaries. What I think is very smart is, for the most part, the unions are holding their fire in terms of endorsing any particular candidate, but they're out there helping build grassroots organizations in every single primary state. I mean, in every state, the core of the activism and the grassroots work are our labor unions. Whether it's the AFT or AFSCME or the laborers or the Teamsters, I don't mean to leave any of them out, right? The firefighters, they are all out there. But it's not just those union members, and that's what Stephen Greenhouse has been writing about, is there's a lot of organizing going on by workers who are acting collectively but not necessarily joining a union. Look at the fast food workers, right? Home healthcare workers, janitors and others. So all of those people too, I think, are involved in the political system. They're looking for candidates who support their issues. They're looking at the Democratic candidates. And so I think the combination, if you will, of our traditional proud labor unions and this new labor force is going to be very powerful in 2020.
I hope so. And of course, before we close it out, we would like to talk about your new project, the Bill Press Pod. Tell us what to expect from the podcast as the election cycle rolls out.
Well, very exciting. First of all, I thank you for having me as a part of your podcast every week. I really value that chance to join you and talk to fellow Democrats, fellow progressives. And after 14 years, Jim, at the Bill Press Show, every morning, getting up at 5:00, right? I just saw talk radio going in a different direction. More and more people listen to podcasts because they can listen any time of day for as long as they want. And so I decided to join the podcast world, which I did June 1. So it's the Bill Press Pod. Thanks for the opportunity to give a plug here. The Bill Press Pod, which is up on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, wherever you are, wherever people go to their favorite podcasts. And I do now 2 a week. On the beginning of the week, a deep dive into some issue. In fact, the podcast, the most recent of the deep dives, is a podcast with 2 leading psychiatrists addressing the question of just how mentally ill is Donald Trump and just how dangerous is it to have such a mentally unbalanced person in the Oval Office. I do that at the beginning of the week, and then on Friday, I always have a roundtable with 3 White House or congressional reporters to talk about the news of the week. That's what I've been doing. The exciting part is, in about a month, I'm going to be joined by former Governor Jerry Brown as part of the podcast, and he and I are going to interview all the remaining 2020 Democratic candidates together, which should be a lot of fun. Jerry particularly wants to talk to them about climate change and about nuclear proliferation, two big issues to him. So that's the Bill Press Pod, and go anywhere again where you find podcasts, the Apple Podcast, and just search the Bill Press Pod, sign up, and you're in business.
It's great stuff. You can get little snippets of it each week on the America's Democrats podcast, of course. And Bill, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to talking to you again soon.
I hope we can do it again soon. All right. Thank you, Jim.
All right, Bill, take care. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the revival of sectoral bargaining and the future of the American labor movement. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Here's a recipe for you. Chop up some Oscar Mayer wieners, stir in Heinz ketchup, blend with Cool Whip and Maxwell House coffee, sprinkle Planters peanuts over the mixture, add A1 steak sauce, then top it with Cheese Whiz and blast it in the microwave. Sounds like a gloppy mess, but an even messier version was cooked up in 2015 when Kraft Foods merged with H.J. Heinz, thus conglomerating more than 200 brand-name products, including all of the above, into one $28 billion a year behemoth. The combine was hailed at the time as a whiz-bang deal that would prove that bigger is always better. Apparently not. 4 years later, Kraft Heinz's sales have slumped, profits are tumbling, its stock price has plummeted by half in the last year, investors are bailing out, shareholders are suing, regulators are investigating, employees are dispirited, and, well, as some business journalists have put it, the mega merger is a mega mess. The Kraft Heinz consolidation was engineered from outside by a Brazilian corporate takeover outfit named 3G, in cahoots with U.S. buyout buccaneer Warren Buffett. They are ideological disciples of the old orthodoxy that the sole responsibility of corporate executives is to jack up the stock price and profits for big shareholders, in this case, themselves. Their self-serving approach to increasing Kraft Heinz's profit was to squeeze costs, meaning squeezing out experienced managers, workers, product development, and the vibrancy of the corporation itself, which has steadily squeezed out their own profits. This is Jim Hightower saying, this old model of self-enrichment through corporate takeover, consolidation, and contraction turns out to be not just bad morals, but bad business. It's time for us, the media, and public officials to start saying no to merger mania.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Against the backdrop of declining membership, a different way of organizing workers is gaining support. Sectoral bargaining not only has the potential to rebuild union membership, David Madlin says it can lead to better working conditions for all workers and reduce economic inequality. And we say hello to David Madlin, Senior Fellow and the Senior Advisor to the American Worker Project at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. He's also the author of Hollowed Out: Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class. David Madlin, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure to have you with us. You've been writing about sectoral bargaining. It's a different way of organizing workers than worksite organizing, which is what most of us are more familiar with. How do the two differ?
Well, as you mentioned, our current system is based mostly on when a majority of workers at a particular work site want to join a union. They then go through a process, and then they negotiate with their direct employer, and they can then improve conditions sort of directly for those groups of workers at that particular work site. So say all of, the butchers at a particular supermarket, but they're not necessarily negotiating for all of the workers at that supermarket, even just like that one sort of kind of classification, nor are they negotiating for all of the workers for in a supermarket in the particular region. And so the idea behind sectoral bargaining is you broaden the base for which you're bargaining, and you ideally try to cover all of the workers in a particular labor market. So you're taking wages out of competition, and you can raise wages and benefits for all workers, whether they're unionized or not. You also then reduce the incentive for employers to fight unionization because everyone's going to have similar wage levels, and you encourage companies to compete based on productivity. And so getting more, everyone's got similar labor costs, and so you got to figure out new inventive ways to do your business.
Well, and worksite level bargaining is not without value, but you have written to some of the specific advantages of sectoral bargaining. For example, what's its potential to reduce economic inequality?
Well, to start off, as you mentioned, worksite level bargaining has worked quite well in a number of respects, and it's clearly very good. It clearly raises wages for workers and increased benefits, and on its own, it also helps reduce economic inequality. But most of the good things that workplace site bargaining does, sectoral bargaining kind of amplifies them. So, for example, you cover a lot more workers with sectoral bargaining, and that in turn means you can have much lower levels of economic inequality. And that's sort of very clear from studies looking at countries that have sectoral bargaining and those that don't, and then countries that have gone towards or away from, and it's sort of clear that they have increasing or decreasing inequality based on what they've done. So worksite is good. Sectoral does more because it covers a lot more people. And, what's also, I think, important is they often can work in conjunction. It's not usually an either-or thing. There's, in most systems where you have sectoral bargaining, you still have some degree of work site bargaining as well, because there are certain issues that are perhaps better handled at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Now, sectoral bargaining has also been successful in closing pay gaps. What's the advantage here?
Yes, it's quite good sectoral bargaining. Again, workplace bargaining does this as well, but sectoral tends to do more. Workplace, both types of bargaining reduce the pay gaps between whites and people of color, blacks and Hispanics. They also reduce pay gaps between men and women. And that occurs for a number of reasons. So when you're bargaining, you tend to set fair pay structures that are based on objectively measurable things. So you reduce the opportunity for discrimination because you have to have either a certain education level or other kind of qualification, seniority to get a particular job. So there's less sort of the overt. But there's also tends to be, and then you also are reducing overall levels of inequality, as we talked about earlier. And when you reduce overall levels of inequality, the differences between the sort of top and the bottom are smaller, and women and people of color are too often at the bottom. And so when you reduce those differences, you've reduced the pay gap. And again, the comparative research is quite clear that traditional workplace bargaining does reduce these gaps, but the broader-based bargaining does a much more effective job. In addition, you also have the last thing I'd mentioned about broader-based bargaining is you have tools to think about the entire sector industry, not just the workplace. And so oftentimes you can see like, hey, this whole sector is predominantly women. Let's think about what we need to do to raise wages across the sector, not just at this one particular work site.
Now, this conversation comes at a time when, despite public support, union membership is at an almost historic low. What's driving these low numbers, and would a shift to sectoral bargaining help reverse the tide?
So, yes, union membership right now is sort of near historic lows, especially in the private sector. Private sector density is around 6%, which is even lower than it was before the National Labor Relations Act was passed, giving workers the right to join a union. So it's really, really bad currently. And that's largely because the law has been so weakened and makes it very, very difficult for workers to join a union. You can name a bunch of things, but one sort of the clearest example is that when employers cross the line and, for example, fire a worker for trying to join a union, which is illegal, the penalties they receive are basically non-existent for that. So there's very little deterrent effect in the current law. There's a number of other flaws, but that's sort of a clear and obvious thing. Now, what sectoral bargaining does, now, it is one part of the solution to increasing union density. On its own, it's nowhere near enough. There's lots of other things we need to do, sort of traditional fixes to labor law. We also need to have strong incentives for workers to join unions, things like that countries like Sweden and Belgium and Denmark have, where they bring unions into helping deliver a key governmental benefit like unemployment insurance. Sectoral bargaining can help also boost union density because it tends to reduce somewhat employer opposition because everyone's going to have similar labor costs, and that tends to increase union membership. But on its own, it's nowhere near enough. It needs to be coupled with lots of other policies. The other thing about sectoral bargaining and sort of union power that I think is important to know is it helps amplify the power. So if you increase density, then you can bargain more effectively with sectoral bargaining because you're covering, again, a lot more workers with that particular type of bargaining.
We're speaking with David Madlin, Senior Fellow and the Senior Advisor to the American Worker Project at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and he is the author of Hollowed Out, Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class. At American Progress, David, you wrote about what has to happen to make sectoral bargaining happen on a broad scale. Some of this involves legal reform. What are some of the current legal obstacles to sectoral bargaining?
The current system is rigged against kind of almost any kind of bargaining, and it's especially rigged against sectoral bargaining. And that's everything from sort of very small, seemingly relatively small things like you can only strike right now against sort of your direct employer if you engage in what's called secondary activity, which is what you need when you're trying to negotiate with lots of multiple employers. You need to be able to strike against various players in the industry. That's prevented. But also, there's a sort of a whole series of other things you think you want to do. You want to do what's so-called extension laws, which is once you have sort of union coverage in the sector that's at, say, 30 or 40%, you want to be able to extend that coverage to other workers in the sector. And we have a little bit of that in the United States with our prevailing wage laws. Those are things like Davis-Bacon laws, that when a government contractor has to pay the wage that is prevailing in a sector, and that prevailing wage can be the union wage once union density is high enough. So we want to build the union power to negotiate. We want to give them the tools with which to negotiate with more employers, and then we want to help extend their ability. And then when there's really very weak union density, or really, when there's no ability to start the bargaining, I think we want to bootstrap it with wage boards, which are these tripartite, which means government, representative of employers, and representative of workers, set minimum standards in a particular industry and/or occupation, and we have history of those in several states. New York, most recently, that's sort of how they got to 15 for fast food workers there several years ago, and that was one of the sort of key uses of that. But several other states have those as well, and you could ramp up their use in particularly low union density sectors and start bootstrapping a kind of sectoral wage setting approach.
Something we never talk about when we're talking about the unions in the fight between unions and business, the stronger union would make the business better. But for some reason, to me, in my opinion, but for some reason, business doesn't see it that way. Does this help kind of get rid of that sort of falsehood?
I think it helps a lot. I think too much of business just rejects unions on we don't want anyone to challenge our power to do whatever we want no matter what, even though the ultimate results might be quite good, as you described, that unions actually, the research is pretty clear, unions, for example, boost overall productivity. But the sectoral approach is particularly good with this. Again, it standardizes wages across a sector, which then forces a competition based on higher productivity. It prevents firms from going on the low road, and it forces them on the high road, which overall tends to be better. And there's also sort of some good comparative international research showing lots of good economic effects for when you have this broad-based coverage forcing the higher productivity and a more efficient use of labor and capital, because you're really directing the right kind of competition in this kind of sectoral setting.
What are some of the policy solutions we need to see that could strengthen unions and encourage sectoral organizing along the way?
Well, there's so many things that we need to do to get our system back on track, because it really right now almost makes it very, very difficult to join a union, and it makes it very difficult to do any type of bargaining. And so lots of the reforms that we need to do, you've probably heard about and discussed on this show and elsewhere. And these are the kinds of reforms that, increasing penalties for employers that violate the law, getting rid of right-to-work laws that allow and encourage workers to free ride off the efforts of others. And then we also need to, I think, more directly not just say the government is going to be neutral about unions, but say we want to actively encourage unions. And I mentioned a little bit this earlier, but the few countries that do something like an actively encourage unions, they tend to do it in this system where they encourage unions to play a key role in helping deliver government subsidized benefit like unemployment insurance. And those countries are among the few around the world that tend to have high and stable union density in today's environment. And then we also want to actually promote sectoral bargaining. So we've strengthened unions through lots of different things, and then we're going to promote sectoral bargaining by, as I mentioned, allowing strikes against secondary employers, but also dramatically increasing the use of prevailing wage laws, by increasing the use of wage boards in sectors where union density is very low. So this move would be very big compared to where we are today, but it is quite consistent and compatible with things we already have in our current system that we can build upon.
And David, looking around the country, where is sectoral bargaining working?
Well, so that's the interesting thing. We have a fairly long history of sectoral bargaining in this country. It's just our system makes it very, very hard to achieve, and it still exists in some sectors. So key ones that you might not have thought about, but are things like the Writers Guild, the television writers. So this is, seemingly like kind of gig work spread out all around the country, and but they negotiate with all the TV with the TV producers, and they have a standard that says, here's the minimum standard you're going to get when your TV show is written, and then the residuals you're going to get. And that's worked quite well for decades, ensuring that workers get paid when they produce, but also helping the producers ensure they're going to have stable, they know what their labor costs are going to be, and they're not going to have disruptions. So we have, those kind of examples, and there's, others in some of the cities. There's in construction, there's significant union density in hotels or even janitorial. It's just that it's sort of too rare today. So I think we can build upon the models we have existing, but also look back to what we've had in the past when we had significantly more of it, and go well beyond than what we had in the past to make it a much more heavy use of sectoral bargaining.
Thinking politically toward 2020, do you see this as an issue progressive politicians are ready to support?
Yes. I think it's this presidential campaign is a start of that discussion. I think, because this is a big change, it will take some time for people to get comfortable and familiar with the issues and the ideas and understand why it's so important and so good. But yes, actually, several of the presidential candidates have publicly come out in support of sectoral bargaining and said it's absolutely essential to both strengthening unions as well as addressing the basic economic problems our country has, including stagnant wages, near record high inequality. And so, it might not be the number one thing that's part of the debate right now, but most of the candidates, or at least, maybe 5 or so, have publicly come out in favor of sectoral bargaining. And so I think it's an idea whose time is really on the rise, and it's the debate, the real public debate is coming.
Yeah, and good, and I hope it continues, and that ball continues to roll. David Madlin, Senior Fellow and the Senior Advisor to the American Worker Project at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, also the author of Hollowed Out, Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, we appreciate your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Why Donald Trump and Michael Pence are joined at the hip. Bill Press talks with Tom LoBianco about his new biography of the enigmatic Vice President.
How closely is Mike Pence connected to the efforts by Donald Trump to get Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 election by investigating Joe Biden? Is Mike Pence a player in that scandal?
Attached at the hip.
Really?
Yeah.
Can't get away from it. Can't divorce himself.
Not anymore. Before, I think maybe he could have argued that there's some walls around him and that he could have feigned ignorance. But boy, after that Washington Post story came out recently saying that Mike Pence's national security advisor was on the phone call with Trump and Zelensky and Mike Pompeo, and gave a readout to Pence. Now, Pence's people argue that he never read that. The fact that Trump directed him what to say in his own meeting with Zelensky, he directed his actions, it's unavoidable. And I think that's why you saw Pence world. Look, Trump, when he deals with messaging, is all over the place. Pence is more a classic cautious politician. So a movement of an inch is a movement of a mile in strategy with him. And when you saw his people start to try to insulate him, saying that he didn't really know what Trump was doing, but then yesterday after that story publishes, Mike Pence says, "Oh no, we have to investigate the Bidens for corruption." That's an implicit acknowledgement that he's in this.
Right. So the beginning they were saying, okay, Trump said, no, don't go to the inauguration of President Zelensky. After all, we'll send Rick Perry instead. that Pence might have done, and meet was Zelensky later on, but that Pence might have done that, but didn't realize what it was all about. What you're saying right now is he can no longer say that.
It's really hard to believe he has no idea what's going on. I mean, he'd have to be incredibly stupid. And actually, as the guy who wrote the book on him, I can tell you he is not incredibly stupid.
Right. So this is one more case where Mike Pence has shown absolute loyalty to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he has to.
Here's the thing that I don't understand. A lot of people don't understand. There could not be, if you just look at the two of them side by side from what we know about them, there could not be two people who are more different, right?
Yeah.
In so many ways. In their lifestyle, in their rhetoric, in their political history. How did the two of these ever get together?
There's a guy,
and you talk about it in your book. I mean, of all you would think Donald Trump would pick somebody like Rudy Giuliani or Chris Christie, whom he considered. Instead, he gets this bland guy from Indiana, whom you covered in India.
While I was working on this, I would talk with people, and everyone just kept on telling me, "Oh, you got to go talk to Stephen Hilbert." And I was like, I don't know. Like, I mean, so who's Steve Hilbert? Steve Hilbert's a former insurance magnate from Indiana. Everyone was telling me, they're like, you got to understand Hilbert to understand how Mike Pence and Donald Trump get connected. Steve Hilbert met his third wife. I mean, this guy is totally simpatico with Trump in a way that Mike Pence is not. And they're good friends from the 90s, from when they used to work together out in Indiana, when Trump was building casinos out there. Stephen Hilbert meets his third wife, Tommy Sue, when she jumps out of a papier-mâché cake naked at the bachelor party for his stepson from the second marriage.
This is Indiana. Yeah. I'm sure Mike Pence was not there.
No, and he was not part of that. Hilbert develops a very close relationship with Donald Trump. And, this is something I write about for the first time in the book. Hilbert is responsible for two things in Donald Trump's life, Mike Pence and his orange tan.
How so? The tan.
The tan. It's true. I couldn't believe it at first. It was incredible. Steve Hilbert owns a tanning products company called Australian Gold.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, yeah. And Hilbert's people told me that Trump, I never believed it, but they're insistent that this is the product, this is the tanning product that Trump uses. Yeah.
Whoa. So Trump comes out, you talk about that, he comes out to meet Pence, right, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he was going to come in and then fly on to somewhere else.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and
exactly.
He gets a flat tire, so he has to spend the night, right?
Yeah. So let me connect this, right? Stephen Hilbert is the one. Mike Pence and Donald Trump have zero relationship, almost non-existent, until June of 2016. And the person who connects them is Stephen Hilbert. Hilbert texts Mike Pence, and it's like, kids passing notes in middle school almost. It's like, if you were to be considered for Donald Trump's running mate, would you say yes? And Pence says yes. And so it starts the process.
Hilbert tells Trump he's got to take a look at Pence.
Yeah, exactly. Hilbert's the connector, and he's the one who starts the ball rolling. Pence is not the top pick. In this moment, in the chronology, in July 2016, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are basically running the show, and as much as they are now. And they like Newt Gingrich. Gingrich is good on TV. He's a big thinker, has big with ideas in a way that their father is not. They think he would mesh very well. Chris Christie has a line in directly with Trump himself for their own relationship. Pence only has Paul Manafort and Reince Priebus at his back. And as we know, Trump does not like to go with the establishment, things that he doesn't like to choke down the medicine. But the thing is that Manafort's pollster, who was the campaign pollster at that time, Tony Fabrizio, had run the numbers and figured out that Pence, of those three, Gingrich, Christie, and Pence, Pence was the only one that actually brought in more voters for them, because it brings back conservatives, but it also brings back evangelicals, quiet Midwestern evangelicals, not the fiery Southern Baptist televangelist types who were already on the Trump train. You didn't need them. So the flat tire so July 12, 2016, Trump campaign lands in Indianapolis for a fundraiser that Stephen Hilbert had set up months earlier. Pops a flat tire. They get stuck there. Trump originally was going to fly on to California alone, and Mike Pence was going to the next day was going to fly to New York alone to meet Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump for the very first time. It's sort of a courtesy call, not because they were taking him seriously. He was going to be there alone without Trump in Trump Tower, which for people who know Pence and understand him, like that's a very weird dynamic for him. So on July 13th, 2016, Trump gets stranded there. And I report this for the first time in the book. They're meeting at the governor's mansion the next morning, and they have breakfast. This has all been reported before, but this meeting is new, or that new to us. They have a meeting after the breakfast, and Trump and Pence sit down across from each other, and it's brass tacks time.
Yeah.
And Trump says, Mike, I need killers. He says, are you going to be a killer? I need killers. He says, look at Chris Christie. Christie's calling me all the time. He wants this. Do you want this? And Pence has this like calm about him. And he says, to be honest with you, I'm not a killer. I don't need this. I will help you lobby. I will help you push legislation. I will help you fundraise with the evangelicals, with conservatives. But I don't need this. I'm okay running for re-election. And whoever, if you need a killer, whoever you pick, I will support you and that person. And Trump is just astounded. And so he presses him, and Trump says, why don't you want this? Like, Christie's calling me now. Like, he wants this. Why don't you want this? And Pence, like, catches the moment. Mm-hmm. And you can almost hear, like, the wink in his response. He says, well, frankly, Mr. Trump, you're sitting in my house on my couch, and your whole family is here. Obviously, the feeling is mutual. Why don't you want me? And Trump
turns it around. Yeah.
Trump is astounded by this. I will just say this, and please pick up the book for the final answer on this.
No, it's a great read.
Oh, man. This kicks open the door. You would think a performance like that would seal the deal, but not with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
This is the thing that kicks open the door. It's something else that happens 2 days later. I'm just going to leave it at that. That which is forceful by the Pence people that seals it for them.
Well, let me ask you this. There's been a lot of speculation about that. You talk a little bit about it. Did Mike Pence get into this thinking that Donald Trump could win?
Their game plan, and I had heard this as rumors.
Or was he
before.
in it just because this was going to make him a national Republican? Trump loses, and then he's got the easy road to 2024.
That's the answer. And I didn't always believe it myself until I've reported it out more for the book. Their game plan was that Trump loses, and then they were already telling donors to get on the Pence train early for 2020. They were going out there telling them, line up now, because we're going to be the Republican nominee in 2020 after Trump loses. So
that was the game plan.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing screws up when Trump accidentally wins.
Yeah.
Right? Which, in a very famous episode, you point out that Karen Pence particularly was not happy with this outcome.
That's right. Yeah, Karen, on election night, it's 1:30 a.m., the phone call comes in from Hillary Clinton to concede, and Mike Pence goes in for a kiss. And they won, theoretically. And Karen turns her cheek and rebuffs him and she says, Michael, you got what you wanted. Now leave me alone. And It was a smoker.
Yeah.
And the first time I heard that, I thought it was because she was angry with Donald Trump. But the more I understood of their joint political ambitions, it was because she was angry with Mike, because they had taken a gamble. The gamble, which seemed like a pretty good bet, was that Trump was going to lose.
Right.
That's a pretty safe bet.
They would be established as the alternative Republican for 2020. But so does that explain why, if you would think, let me put it this way, there was one thing in the 2016 campaign where Mike Pence would say, I can't do this anymore, and that is the Access Hollywood tape.
Yeah.
Is that why? Does that explain, again, thinking he was going to lose, that he would stay there even after the Access Hollywood tape broke.
Yeah, it's the same reason that Mitch McConnell stuck with Trump, right? And all the other ones, not, Paul Ryan jumps off and Chris Christie jumps off, but, the rest of the folks are trying to keep their head low, right? And like ride it out.
They might have jumped off. They didn't stay off for long, right?
They jumped back on.
Right, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Think of it in the moment, and this is what I tried to do throughout the book: is not think of it where we are now, but try to live in that moment and what is rational, what makes the most sense. Trump's going to lose in 30 days, so why would you stick your neck out when you could just let time take its course, and everything will take care of itself? I mean, Trump winning just screwed all their political calculations. Everybody, Pence, McConnell, all of them.
One of the things that you mentioned, the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Pence, Karen and Mike Pence, that once Mike became vice president, he adopted what they call the Billy Graham rule.
Oh, yeah. So,
what is that? And did he practice that in Indiana when he was governor?
Yeah. So, and this is, people ask me about that a lot. So where you won't dine alone with another woman who's not your wife, or have drink, be in a room with alcohol with another woman who's not your wife. This has gotten some attention before. What I found is that when he was living in Indiana and before he goes to Congress, he didn't follow that rule, because I interviewed somebody who who used to be on the radio with him, Kate Shepard, Indiana radio veteran, and she would have lunch with him on the weekends whenever she did the news and he did his call-in show, and they would have lunch together alone because there's nobody else at the studio. Perfectly fine, not weird. Everything was great.
Right.
Very cordial, very normal. It's not until he comes to Washington that he adopts that rule. Some of it seems to be political pandering. Some of it does seem to be real, too. The other thing that I noticed is that it's almost like signal boosting. So when I'm around other people from Baltimore here in Washington, my Baltimore starts to come out, and my O's start to turn into O's, right?
Yeah.
And we're doing it because, are we that far from home? 45-minute drive, not really. But, you're kind of you're signaling to other people. One of Pence's friends told me as I was reporting the book, so why does he call Karen mother? People in southern Indiana do that. It's a little bit of an older thing, but it is also sort of native to southern Indiana, right? Just around there, they talk that way. Not all the time. So she told me, one of his friends, Marjorie Dannenfelser, told me that, look, when you come to Washington, you start yearning for home a little bit more. And then when you run into other people, maybe you signal boost a little bit, right? So you say, start calling Karen mother. I think that's where this comes from.
Wow. And the Billy Graham rule as well.
Yeah.
Again, the book is Piety and Power, Mike Pence and the Taking of the White House.
Bill Press talking with Tom LoBianco, author of Piety and Power, Mike Pence and the Taking of the White House. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Madeline, Bill Press, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.